content that Molly had been algorithmically recommended on a couple of social media platforms, Instagram and Pinterest, had directly contributed to her death. And that is the first time that we're aware anywhere in the world that a coronial court had made those findings of fact.
Welcome to the Beacon podcast. This podcast is going to be about exploring the rise of populism and authoritarianism in democracies around the world. And my name's Miles, and my theory is that it's basically all about the phones. Social media platforms, algorithms, and phones. I think the way that we are interacting with the attention economy is what is driving a lot of the growth in populism, in authoritarianism, and in various forms of radicalization in the world. But the problem is that I am no expert on such things. So today I've invited Andy Burrows, who is CEO of the Molly Rose Foundation, a foundation dedicated to child protection online, to speak to me. And Andy has forgotten more about regulating this sector than I will ever know. And so it's a real treat to have him on today. And without further ado, let's see what he had to say. Well, good afternoon, Andy. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a big year for online platform regulation already, and we're only in April. So thank God I've got you here to explain it all to me, because frankly, I could use some explaining. But no, I wanted to first. I wanted to ask you. I know you're currently CEO of the Molly Rose Foundation. Can you tell me about the Molly Rose Foundation and why it was set up?
Sure, and it's really great to be with you, Miles. Thanks for having me on. So, Molly Rose Foundation was founded after the death by suicide of Molly Russell back in November 2017. She was 14 when she died, and at Molly's inquest, which took almost 5 years to take place, then the coroner ruled that the online content that Molly had been algorithmically recommended on a couple of social media platforms, Instagram and Pinterest, had directly contributed to her death. And that is the first time that we're aware anywhere in the world that a coronial court had made those findings of fact. Ian, Molly's father, first told her story a couple of years after Molly's death, and I don't think ever anticipated that the circumstances of her death would gain the profile or the level of public concern that it generated. But the foundation now works in Molly's memory to push for safer, stronger online worlds for children. Our grounding is that the harm that Molly came to, and that we know that too many children continue to face every day in the UK, is inherently preventable. It comes from the commercial decisions, it comes from the business models, it comes from the design choices of these platforms. We can change those, and so through policy, through research, through campaigning, and through education, we are determined to help young people live long and stay strong. And those, in fact, are words that Molly herself wrote in one of her journals just a few weeks before she died.
It's a very sobering thing, and but it's so important that once harm is demonstrated, we can react to it, and we can regulate, and we can think about what the solutions are. I know Molly Rose wasn't your first experience in this area. What was your career up to being appointed as CEO?
Yeah, I think I'm something of an online safety veteran now, Miles. So I've been working
A
on this.
dubious honour at best.
So I've been working in this space for about a decade. I previously worked at NSPCC, where I led their online safety work and led the campaign that secured the initial commitment to introduce the Online Safety Act when Matt Hancock, no less, was the secretary of of states. Over the course of that decade, we've seen, we have seen meaningful change. I think, at times it feels like the pace has been very glacial. But actually, when I started in this space a decade ago, the idea that we could start to bring these companies to heel, that we could regulate tech companies, was really seen as something for the birds. The arguments that tech lobbyists had peddled for many years was that, these problems were too big. They were not ones that individual nation states could take forward, still in a situation where the prime ministers of the day would genuflect before the likes of Mark Zuckerberg when they came to town. We have made a huge amount of progress, but I think, we've heard a lot in the last few weeks about comparisons to other sectors where it took a long time to regulate and legislate, big tobacco being the obvious example. These are long-term fights, and I guess I must like a challenge.
I mean, hopefully not that long term, because obviously tobacco took a lot longer to get through. But it seems like 2026, it seems like there's been a real breakthrough. We've had the beginning of enforcement of Australia's under 16 social media ban. We've now had a jury in LA finding against Meta and YouTube. Everywhere I look, it seems like the Information Commissioner's Office, Ofcom, the Competition Markets Authority, everyone's sort of circling around the big social media platforms. What has happened? What has changed?
Look, I think we are in a period when there is a huge opportunity to make progress on the online safety space. I mean, it comes frankly after about 18 months where we really hadn't seen the progress that we needed. The geopolitical headwinds from the Trump administration in the United States had really had a chilling effect on the appetite here in the UK to go further. We had very much, kind of been in a holding pattern. But I think we are now in a period where we are seeing a huge amount of potential to make really meaningful progress on these issues. It's positive to see. I mean, and I'm sure we'll get onto this, though we don't support the Australian social media ban. It is fantastic to see governments like Australia using the political will that they have to make progress on these issues. We are seeing in the EU, in Canada, in Brazil, either moves to really make a step forward with enforcement where legislation is already there, or to bring in, really great examples of new regulation. And the verdict that we've seen in California and indeed also in New Mexico, I think really will be, when we look back in a few years' time at how we finally tamed these companies, that will be a landmark moment. Whether this is through legislation, whether this is through regulation, or whether it is in the courts, the tech companies and their excuses are really now starting to run out of road. So I am really hopeful that 2026 can be the year that we make really decisive progress. And frankly, look, it is too little, it is too late. We've seen successive governments, we've seen regulators, we've seen tech companies, most of all, really drag their heels when it comes to online child safety. But I think most of all, really, we are looking at a tipping point where, it's really clear that parents' patience has snapped. I think probably Westminster for too long has not necessarily recognise the saliency of online safety as a political issue, but this is something that clearly is a worry to every parent, every family up and down the UK. And really, as I say, I think, parents' patience snapped very much at the start of this year.
I mean, it's a hard thing for a British government to take on. Obviously, these companies are large American companies. They've got significant profit centers, and that gives them access to free cash. And I can just imagine that going after these almost exclusively American companies was going to be a very difficult thing for a British government to do. But uh, you know, the threats of tariffs are a bit different now that they've all happened. You can't sort of threaten us with that again. And do you think? Have you felt a change in the way the government is approaching this now that we've obviously got a less friendly administration, and now that a lot of the things that you might have worried that even a Biden administration might try or might even threaten, they've already happened.
Look, last year, I think the effects of the incoming Trump administration, the prospect of tariffs, the trade deal with kind of signs at the time that online safety was put on the table in those talks, that really had a chilling effect. And I think lots of us who had heard from the Labour Party in opposition, recognising the shortcomings of the Online Safety Act and signalling that they would go further. The now deputy leader of the Labour Party, Lucy Powell, had committed to a new act in opposition. Then as Trump came in, we really just saw all progress stall. Now that, as you say, I think, we are in a materially different place. I think we are starting to see, really because of the domestic pressure at home, a sign that Downing Street knows that they need to go further. I think there is more work to do. One of the issues that I think we still need to overcome is this sense that um, you know, regulation of these companies actually, can be pro-growth. The Chancellor herself wrote to us and acknowledged that online safety regulation was pro-growth. It wasn't anti-growth. I don't think that's always something, though, probably because, the tech lobbying has become so ingrained, is something that is always really recognised by Treasury officials and Number 10. Look, ultimately, when it comes to making the online world safer, when it comes to strengthening online safety regulation, first and foremost, it's the right thing to do. We should not be sacrificing or trading off children's safety for trade deals or commercial pressures, or because of geopolitics. And the public feels that very, very strongly when we've polled them. But also, more than that, look, the business models of some of the large platforms has been inherently extractive. It's been based on a commercial incentive whereby the tech companies have not built in safety features, and those harms have then been passed on to children and families in the form of abuse, in the form of mental health, and that also stacks up in terms of costs to the NHS, cost to law enforcement, having to deal with the ever increasing amount of criminality that is being driven by social media. DCIT's own estimates show that an online safety act that was capable of reducing exposure to online harm by 15% would deliver £4 billion a year in annualized economic return. So I think, we are now starting to see progress, but, it is one of those things where I think the Treasury and Number 10 would do well to actually look at what their own data says, because, this isn't a question of having to necessarily make trade-offs between doing the right thing for children's safety and growth. Actually, making sure these companies play by the rules of the road as set out by the UK, that is a win-win.
It's a just listening to you set out the sort of the way these companies have acted. It does, and I'd like to ask you about the under 16 social media ban. Now, when I first heard about this, um, so I'm coming at this from perhaps a different place. I'm worried about what social media and online media is doing to our politics,
Mm.
and I thought, oh, great, this is an opportunity to poke these extremely powerful platforms in the eye. This is perhaps a way to disrupt the onboarding of young people onto these platforms, and eventually that will diminish their power overall. Um, and so, I was all well. My initial instinct was all in favour. My understanding is that you're not in support of the under social media bans for under 16s. Could you lay out that position for me?
Yeah, sure. And, I think it's really important to say from the get-go that the current position is absolutely untenable, is absolutely untenable. The status quo is putting children in harm's way. So, no one is arguing that this is a matter of a ban or tolerating the status quo. it absolutely isn't. But I think, look, the concerns that we really have about a ban, I can understand why any parent, will hear about the prospect of a social media ban, and it seems, it seems like a silver bullet. It seems like a quick fix. But I think our concern is that it simply will not deliver what parents want. Because what we can see from the polling is that parents want to have confidence that we will see decisive action on online safety, and the early evidence from Australia shows that actually what a ban risks delivering is a false sense of safety to parents and to children, because the indications are that the majority of children are still on these platforms. They are not having to go out of their way to be able to circumvent the rules. It is very, very easy to be able to flout the ban.
Mm.
And so we end up with a situation where where the children are still on these products, but there is the sense that the box has been ticked, that the problem is solved, and that then means that children are still facing the same dangers. They are still facing the risks that come from products that are poorly designed for with their interests in mind. They are still being subject to the harmful toxic algorithms. But then, the onus is taken off the tech companies to then make sure that their platforms are safe. Now, some people have argued that we could have a kind of a ban plus approach where we ban some of the largest social media platforms, but then still move forwards with regulation. I have to say, as someone who spent, a couple of years after the Online Safety Act was being passed, being told by politicians across all parties in Westminster that we had an act and so that problem was ticked. Maybe we'll come back to it later in the Parliament. Regrettably, I think that is wishful thinking. The other point that I think really concerns me about a social media ban is that look, we know that children will be able to find a way to navigate around this, and as I say, in Australia the indications are that actually their accounts just aren't being taken down in the first place. Now, if we are still enabling children to go on these platforms, but then we are putting barriers in the way of them being able to disclose when something bad happens to them, then we risk putting children at risk. And for many, many years, when I've worked, Miles, on child sexual abuse, and I've seen the most appalling cases of child sexual abuse, of online grooming, the consistent thread in those cases is where children have felt that they are unable to disclose because they are worried that they will be in trouble. They will be, kind of worried about the consequences if they disclose what is happening to them. Now, if we are saying that children should not be on these platforms, but they are, and then they're still facing the same level of risk, we are putting barriers in the way of children being able to disclose. Now, I fully understand that people calling for a ban are doing so with the very best of intentions. They have children's interests in mind. But as someone who's worked in this space for many, many years, I really worry about the unintended consequences here. So, as I say, we don't support a ban, but we absolutely should not tolerate the status quo either. And that's where we do have an opportunity to go and really decisively strengthen the Online Safety Act so that, if children are going to be using these products one way or the other, and I don't think we can put the toothpaste back in the tube, it's wishful thinking to assume that we can, then we make sure that those products are fundamentally safe and we treat this as the product safety issue that it ultimately is.
And it reminds me a bit of the way that the United States and Europe treat food additives. So whereas in Europe, the food additives are banned until they're proven safe, whereas in the United States they're banned, allowed until they're proven harmful. I wonder if a social media ban might have been more useful 15, 20 years ago, um, when you might have been able to police it and cause effects, and then you could have slowly lifted restrictions on children rather than having to cut them off all at once. It seems, yeah, but we do have an opportunity coming up to get some regulation in first. Obviously, AI is producing new and interesting tools all the time, but one that's very new and you know perhaps interesting is not the right word, is the rise of the nudification apps.
Mm,
Um,
mm.
Obviously, this is too early for there to be an awful lot of evidence of what harm it's doing to children, but I can't imagine that it's great. How would you how do you feel like? I think this also sort of speaks to like parents, patients just snapping. Social media. There are good things on social media. There are bad things about on social media. Allowing children to access to, you know, to create synthetic, images, nudifying people. This feels bad, and it feels like exclusively bad. Is there anything we can do to derail that and treat some of the things coming out of AI differently than we have social media?
Yeah, and look, I think we were all rightly horrified at the start of the year by the way in which Grok, in particular, was enabling this nudification, appalling misogynistic abuse of women and of high-profile women, but also those images, that technology equally being able to produce naked images of children, which
Another
I
tough
think.
one for the British government, as Donald's friend is unleashing this on the world while being part of his government. I don't envy them, but yeah.
I mean, actually, though, kind of as appalling as Grok was, I think we can actually take some hope from the way in which the UK responded to that, because that was one of the first instances where, yes, as a result of real public pressure, we saw ministers, we saw the Prime Minister, we saw Ofcom, the regulator, step up. Ofcom opened an investigation. The government were very clear, and that led to Grok falling into line. That led into that led to X discontinuing the worst of that product. And I think there is something there that really shows that if the political will is there, then the companies will ultimately comply with the regulation that is put in place. For all the bluster, for all the lobbying, undoubtedly for the litigation that might follow, ultimately platforms by and large will comply with the pressure in these markets. And I think, one thing that perhaps we are guilty of in the UK is assuming that, we are too small to be able to take some of these countries, to take some of these companies head on. And frankly, do you know what? That is nonsense, because for most of these tech companies, for most of the big social networks, we are one of the five largest commercial markets for these platforms. The platforms are not going to, pick up their toys and walk away because we're going to regulate them. We're going to set basic conditions around enforcing their terms of service, around, addressing criminal behavior on their platforms. They will comply with these rules. And, ultimately, what Grok shows is that this is a matter of political will. And if we are prepared to stand up and, set out what it takes to comply with UK law, to fulfill with British values, then the companies will eventually comply. But like on AI more broadly, look, the prospect, the risks that we're already starting to see from AI are real. Whether that is around AI being used to produce new child sexual abuse images that very often will be harvested from the images and identities of real victims. Whether this is about AI being able to produce, increasingly more shocking and impactful suicide and self-harm images. That's something that I'm already starting to see on some of the large social media platforms. We have a problem here, and I think one of the things that I find very frustrating when it comes to AI is that we are not learning the lessons of a decade or so of old tech, of social media and the like. It feels like we're having to go back and litigate first principles, that if we don't insist on safety, if we don't insist on regulation to start with, then eventually when that has to happen, it ends up being so costly, and we've seen a lot of harm play out in the long run. It is absolutely possible to say that we can leverage the economic and the amazing social benefits of AI, and all the transformative effects that it's going to have on our economy, whilst also setting out basic safeguarding obligations and not just giving these companies a pass. It really, as I say, is just a matter of political will. And I think I am, hopeful that with enough countries that are seeing the world through a similar lens, through Australia, the UK, Canada, the EU, Brazil, which is, kind of proving to be a real leader when it comes to online safety issues, that maybe we can start to see progress on these issues. But, we absolutely cannot allow history to repeat itself.
Well, I think you've strayed into the area that I'm most interested in now. I think so. My thesis really is that the online platforms are pretty bad for us all, actually, not just children, and that they're promoting forms of radicalization, you know, um, across the spectrum. Where you will be familiar with what can happen to children with relation to self-harm and suicide. I'm more focused on what's happening to voters and where their views are becoming more extreme. But I'm also interested
Oh,
in. Oh,
sorry, I'm back.
it's all right. But no, I'm also interested in the social media platforms being large, profitable businesses with free cash in the same way that, for example, tobacco companies and oil companies are. Um, and having just read Sarah Wynne Williams' book about her time at Facebook, I was very struck by politicians' eagerness to be in with the social media platforms, in with the leaders of these platforms. I was wondering, so we've talked about this sort of. Well, we're not reaching an avalanche yet, but hopefully. Um, but their power seems to be coming undone somewhat. Uh, do you think that is happening, and do you feel like a new ability for politicians to resist their power and basically stand up to these hyper billionaires? I don't know. I don't think any of them have quite cracked a trillion yet, but they're on their way.
I am really hopeful that we are moving towards that tipping point where we can see, countries, and it is clearly very hard for any individual country to take a stand, not least with the geopolitics that we now find ourselves in. But we are starting to see countries, seeing the world through a similar lens, recognizing that, this is about fundamental matters of public safety. It is about democracy. It is about, the health of our information ecosystem. And look, ultimately, it is about the nation state being able to assert itself and its sovereignty in the face of, tech firms that have, actively spoken about, kind of wanting to transcend the nation state. So this is, a really crucial test of nation states being able to, assert that we can, set the rules and the laws of the lands that we live in. And I am hopeful that we will see progress in that respect. One thing that's really interesting, though, I think, is, clearly when the Online Safety Act was being passed in the UK, it was controversial legislation in terms of whether measures should apply to adults. And clearly there was, a big furore about the free expression implications of regulating online safety, of regulating tech platforms. And so we ended up with a bill that was much more focused on children. What I think is really interesting is, I see a disconnect between the way in which some of those arguments played out in Parliament and in SW1, and I think the way in which, frankly, lots of the country see these issues. So, we have a situation where we know that clearly, there are many people not least women, who will be deterred from going on social media. Their own free expression is being curtailed, because, kind of these platforms are very often toxic. We are concerned about the power of algorithms and what that can do to trust in public institutions, to kind of confidence in democracy, and kind of all of the ways in which that is already. I think for the public at large, there is a real appetite, not just for children but for adults, to have a real grown-up conversation about how we can start to regulate these platforms in a way that, yes, is absolutely not impinging on freedom of speech, but that can start to, at the very least, give adults better ability to start to exercise agency over their social media platforms. Because I think lots of us right now, an Ofcom data last week was very interesting, showing that we are starting to spend less time on social media. There's increased concern about the effects of social media. Lots of us, I think, probably as adults, can see the addictive nature of algorithms, the fact that kind of we are the product, our attention is very much kind of what these products are ruthlessly seeking to exploit. But right now we're faced between a choice of just having to lump that, or delete or not use these apps altogether. I think actually there's a big proportion of the British public that would like to be able to see a middle ground where they can use these products, but they can start to have a safer experience, and they can start to have more agency and control, rather than the kind of take it or leave it, really exploitative products that we see today.
A very strange place we've come to, where sort of some of the most vociferous defenders of free speech are people with pretty authoritarian politics, and it seems like people on the more liberal side have forgotten how to regulate things. So obviously, free speech is a liberal cause, and it's something that's traditionally been promoted by on that side of politics, uh, but the limits of freedoms has always been the harm principle, and I am free to do things as long as it doesn't harm other people. And it does feel like that the sort of debate we've been having, which has been focused on free speech for such a long time, is now moving on to harm. And I think and children are absolutely the first place to regulate, and the first place to look for those harms and to ensure that they're not happening. But they're not. But perhaps they're not the limit. Do you think there are any changes that we can make in regulation to how algorithms work, how consumers interact with these products, that could sort of blunt some of these radicalization pipelines? Be they far right or manosphere, or just general misogyny. We've obviously attacked things like pipelines that send people down to Islamic terrorists in the past. I wonder if there's more we can do, and if there's obviously more than we can do.
Yeah, and look, I think the answer is that there absolutely is. Before coming on to kind of what we can do by regulation, I think one absolutely critical thing that we need to start to do is to really, really invest in critical literacy and critical online literacy in schools, and in particular, a real focus on algorithmic harm, and the way in which the content that we see online is the product of of commercial drivers and of personalized algorithms, and the content we see and the order we see it on social media kind of is not neutral. That, I think, is something that we need to start to teach as a real foundational skill in schools, rather than it being something that is tacked onto the curriculum. It is something that is seen as a real foundational life skill, that we're giving teenagers the ability to start to exercise that critical judgment about what they're seeing online and why they see it online. That's a really powerful way of teens being able to keep themselves safe in the immediate term. But also, those teens were then tomorrow's adults, and the ability to be able to critically analyze and reflect on what we're being served online is going to be hugely important for them as adults, as misinformation, as foreign actors increasingly look to target the information ecosystem. This is important in terms of democracy and in terms of political discourse. So I'd really like to see the government go much further than we've seen already in terms of the curriculum review, and really recognise that, as I say, online digital literacy and algorithmic literacy should be a core foundational life skill. But we can do much more around regulation as well. The measures there are measures in the Online Safety Act that has still not come into force. They've been heavily delayed. That will start to give users the ability to exercise some very limited say on whether they want to see certain types of content. But we can go much further. Some of this is about transparency. It's about being able to properly investigate how algorithms work, and to see, kind of if they are being skewed in particular directions, if they will take people down rabbit holes of radicalization, and the like. I think, there, as I say, there is. I suspect there is a much greater public appetite in the UK public at large than perhaps is sometimes understood in Westminster to be able to start to take on some of those issues of the manosphere, of online toxicity, of mis and disinformation. And I think this is a debate that so often just become immediately we see so much heat and very little light, and immediately we start to see this being seen as it's an attack on free expression, rather than being able to have a nuanced conversation about where we might need to sensibly go further. And look, ultimately, I think this is the thing. To go back to the ruling in California, one of the reasons that was so important is because in the US, US legislation there, Section 230, coupled with the First Amendment, has given the social media platforms really carte blanche to ignore safety risks in the guise that is free expression. What the California verdict really was all about was ultimately saying that when we are talking about product design, when we are talking about algorithms, we are not talking about free speech in the first instance. We are talking about the nuts and bolts, the systems and processes of how the platforms are designed and how they work. And if we keep the focus on the nuts and bolts, the incentives around how these companies build their services, around how their algorithms work, that is a sensible, right place to start. And it means, that we're not talking about individual pieces of content, which clearly, then is exceptionally fraught, which can be a slippery slope in all directions. But we are talking about the systems, the processes, the algorithmic reasons why we end up being seen, why we end up seeing, the content that we see in the volumes that we see, at the times that then we're recommended it.
And of course, as we move away from sort of an ideological or sort of principled debate about freedom of expression and into a debate about harm, it gives us a lot more leeway to talk about numbers, to find evidence, to get data, to drive this policy with something other than the white the white heat of our convictions. And all of our political talking points. And I I think there's a lot of I think the difficulty, and I suspect you must face this all the time, the difficulty of dealing with politicians who are conflicted, because these platforms, these modes of communication, they benefit some politicians and not others. And so there are, necessarily, it's very difficult to get people to vote against their meal ticket, and this is one of them. But no, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, an expert, what advice you would give to uh, parents and to people in general about how they can protect themselves online, what is it that we should be doing, um, other than stopping watching podcasts, which we should never do. We should always be watching podcasts. I think we can all agree with that. But if there are, if the how is there any sort of evidence-backed practices that we can do to improve our absorption of all of this media?
Look, if you're a parent, first and foremost, the advice that I would give would be don't panic, which sometimes is easier said than done. But secondly, do you know what? The best advice I can give is really simple advice. Lots of parents, I think, are really worried about their children's online safety. They also feel really nervous about bringing up the issues. It's one of those issues that is like the talk, and it becomes really stressful. Then we don't do it very well. Look, my advice would be it's really simple. When you're sat with your kids in the evening and they've come back from school and you're asking them what they've done at school that day, start asking about what they've seen online, what they're enjoying online. Understand their online lives as much as you'll understand all the other parts of their lives. Just make it a regular part of the conversation, because that way you take away the sting, you take away the worry that you're the grown up that doesn't understand the online world. You're just taking an interest, and that way then I think it just becomes a normal part of the conversations that you'll have with your kids. You can start to build up just the relationship of trust with your children. And the reason that that is so important is because then that means that you can practically work together to, understand, what are the right boundaries for your kid, kind of where are they in terms of like their development. You can then, help them to, practically set the right, kind of age limits and the right content controls on their platforms. But it also then means that, if your child sees something that will worry them or upsets them, if something is happening, they're being bullied, whatever it might be, they know that they can come and talk to you and then you can work it through together. So, it's the most basic advice, but it's really fundamental. Just start having those regular conversations. Make this just a key part of like the conversation that you have with your kid every day. Take an interest. It's a part of their lives, for better or worse, it's a part of their lives. Take an interest, get to know it, understand it, because that way, then it becomes, a part of their world that you can understand, and that then you can help to navigate together. And I think look, it is hard for those of us as adults. I'm definitely guilty of spending far too much time on this thing and losing half an hour watching endless reels. And we all are. But I think it's good to be mindful of kind of how much time we are spending on these devices. It is good to try and exercise some kind of good sense of digital hygiene. So I was talking about if you're sat with your kids having dinner, one of the worst things that I think lots of us as adults do is completely fail to model the behaviors we want from our kids. We're saying let's have a social media ban for kids. Whilst frankly, too many of us will have these phones in our hands at the dinner table or, sat on the sofa. One of the best things that we could all do as adults is start to, model our values better, particularly when there's young people in our lives. It's really hard. No, and we shouldn't feel guilty about this. And in particular, parents should not feel guilty about this, because, it is really, really hard, and it's something that we're all having to navigate together. But those little baby steps, just starting to model those values a bit better, can go a long way.
You've I was going to say that was excellent advice, but I can't say that I'm calmed down. I've got my daughter is 6 months old, and I've just started to notice, her eyes will follow mine to the phone, and I've got to, I've got to start putting it down. And but no, I think that's probably a property of the time in her life rather than your advice. I think your advice is probably pretty, but I am not. I'm finding myself becoming more panicky, not less. Um, but no, I think that would be great. Well, thank you so much, Andy. This has been so interesting, and I think we've really sort of covered it. Let's hope, maybe I can have you back on in 2027, and you can tell me, well, the whole world has changed, and the world is regulated, and we're set to do even more this year. It's on this course, I don't think it's impossible. Andy, before you go, where can people find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, so if you go to our website, mollyrosefoundation.org, you can find much more detail about what we do, about our policy work, about our research work. You can also find out more about our education work. If you're a teacher, if you're looking for materials to have those online conversations with children, with young people, and you can also find sources of support there, including trusted organisations where you can go to for help and support with mental health and suicide.
Brilliant. And I can imagine that a few of our listeners, especially ones that are more worried on this issue, would want to support your work at Molly Rose Foundation. What is it that they can do most impactfully?
Get in touch with us. We're always happy to find out more about to help you find out more about our work, whether that is supporting our public policy campaigns, whether that is helping to put pressure on tech companies and the regulator and government to act, whether that is through to being able to, kind of support our work, whether that is through expertise or through fundraising. Any and all help is gratefully received, because ultimately I'm really proud of the amazing work that we do at MRF and that civil society is doing in this space, but it is a David and Goliath battle, and that I think will continue to be the case.
Takes me back to my days fundraising at the NSPCC. I was there briefly, just for a year or so, and it's always important to get that ask in. Obviously, you're facing up against billionaires. It would be good if you could keep the lights on. But no, I'll leave it there. Andy, thank you so much. And no, I look forward to speaking to you again.
Thanks so much.
Well, a massive thank you to Andy there. I thought he brought up some really interesting things, and it just shows that regulating these sorts of products is hard, and the amount of nuance and data and information about the harm that these platforms can do is, it requires experts and specialists to look into it and to come up with sensible policies that then politicians can support and bring into being. So no, a massive thank you to Andy. I hope you found this podcast interesting. If you did, please do leave a like and subscribe to the video. You can also find us at readthebeacon.org, where you'll be able to find our Substack. And if you really liked it, you can even sign up for a paid subscription there. But no, anything you can do to promote this in the algorithms would be greatly appreciated. Thank you very much, and we'll catch you later for more Beacon Podcast.